Well, welcome everyone. I am Joanne Geer, and I'm the Executive Director for the Westchester Biotech Project. And today we are having a roundtable on ethical perspectives in artificial intelligence. You're going to be hearing from Dr. Ryan Felder, who will speak for around 30 minutes, and then we will be calling on a number of different discussants who will introduce themselves, make some comments and questions, and then there will be lots of time. I'll actually call on people who are here and invite you to introduce yourself and to make comments or questions. We will record the whole session, but when we post it to YouTube, we only do the part basically with the people who are clearly speakers. But if you're a guest and you say something really fascinating that we'd like to use, we'll ask for your permission. I want to make a special acknowledgement to our gold partner, Montero Language Services, their life science division. This is a company based in New York and Madrid that focuses on translation of materials for clinical research and also intellectual property related to life sciences. They have taken a 2-year commitment, and we just really like to thank them every time we get a chance. I'm going to introduce Michael Welling. He and I are the co-founders of Westchester Biotech Project. Michael, take it away.
Thank you, Joanne, and good evening, everyone. And where I am today, there has been no sun until the last 5 minutes as I was getting ready to speak here. So if it gets a little blinding, I apologize for that. I too want to thank Montero as well, both for their support and their partnership, but just to their commitment to our community, which entails all of you here today and on the broader scale. We really feel as though we have started pushing some boundaries and initiating some conversations that are really important and necessary to be having. And while there are certainly pockets of some of these dialogues taking place, as you will hear today, we feel that our efforts in trying to bring these individuals together, these organizations together, to have those conversations on a broader scale themselves is really critical to what our mission is. And our mission, as you see on this slide here, is to inspire collaborations between researchers, data scientists, engineers, and the communities that support them, or as Joanne likes to say, and the people that love them. So I am none of those things, but I come to this world having been through a personal experience where the work of these folks in the back labs and on the front line of patient care contributed to the saving of my own son's life. And it's just been a gift that we just never want to lose sight of how valuable it is, nor our responsibility in giving back to that. So I can't appreciate Joanne enough and the work and effort she's put into this, as this biotech project has been our joint vision of trying to not just thank those people and support those people, but further the work of these people to make meaningful impacts on our communities. Now, we talked about Montero, and that really is an exciting partnership, but the work that we do, the work that you see here today, the work we've done over the last number of years is not possible without our community. And we built this organization to be all about our community. And you see on this slide here a sample of those partners that we have that range the gamut from municipalities to business organizations to research organizations to actual drug development organizations and beyond. We thank all of these people and those people whose name is not currently up here. And as part of sort of our organization's tenet, if there's any name up here that any of you would like to be introduced to or want to have a conversation or have a thought or an idea how your work might help them or complement theirs, please reach out to Joanne and I. We love making those conversations, and truly it's what drives our effort here. And of course, if you want to see your organization's name up on this slide or their own slide like Montero, we also welcome those conversations to talk about what a partnership might look like. And truly, we make sure that it's something that, as the sun is blocking my face, I apologize, but we try to make sure that that partnership is something that is a two-way street, that your contributions obviously are meaningful here, but that also your participation here derives benefit for you and your organization as well. So two of our biggest sort of initiatives, one which is driving today's conversation, is our Career Consortium, which is a collaboration of private sector, public sector, educational institutions in making sure that those folks that are interested in or have already taken the leap into the research world have all the support and opportunities that they need to continue on that path. As Joanne loves to say, it's easier to become a researcher than it is to remain a researcher. So one of our big support mechanisms here is to help create opportunity, further their knowledge and education and skills, and make sure that there is a sort of a coalescing, if you will, between academia and the private sector for their benefit. The other big initiative, of course, is our Westchester Data Analytics Hub, which is sort of the sponsoring arm of our organization here today. And data is obviously at the heart of everything. And you will hear from many of our speakers and participants here their role in the data world. But we've created this data analytics hub, not as a brick and mortar entity at the moment, but rather a foundational place for conversation to be had amongst individuals who are using data, analyzing data, and looking for data to make sure that the sort of traditional barriers to our daily lives, whether it be politics or finances or whatnot, doesn't remain the barrier to bringing these people together and sharing and collaborating and solving the problems we all need solved. Obviously, you know, the big one, of course, being COVID, but this has been our mission long before that, and making sure that life-saving treatments and medications are made available to those who need them. So kicking off today, I'm taking the honor of the first official introduction of Dr. Ryan Felder, who's going to lead our conversation today. You know, it's amazing how you meet people. It's amazing how the universe works. But we met Ryan thanks to his lovely wife, who I know through completely unrelated business dealings and the Westchester Biotech project. But the universe put us all together, and we are really, really excited to have him share both his insight into these ethical questions for AI, but also as we help him launch his new career, which I think will be the basis for some future presentations and conversations as well. So without any further ado, I turn it over to Dr. Felder.
Okay, thank you so much for the introduction. As Michael said, this is my first talk given after I received my degree. I've done many before, but it's particularly nice to be able to share this research that I've been working on. So one caveat before I begin talking. So I have a Ph.D. in philosophy, very far outside of what most people here are used to. So, you know, there's very much a bit of a disciplinary gap that we're going to be trying to bridge here. So, you know, if I say things that that don't necessarily seem clear, it may not be you that's not understanding. So I hope to, in any chance, get some feedback from people over like what you think I'm doing well, what you think I could improve on, because I really like the idea of collaborating with people outside of my own, you know, my own zone of comfort, so to speak. So very much excited to hear what people think about all this. So philosophers like to talk a bit about what we don't want to talk about. So I'm going to do a little bit of that in just a moment. So this slide you kind of have from the messaging for the talk today. So we're really going to be dealing with three sorts of big questions here. So one question is, what is the black box problem? This has gotten a bit of press in recent years. And it's a really crucial issue for those who are sort of involved in AI algorithm design. So I want to spend a good amount of time talking about what the black box problem even is, and I want to say a bit about what I take to be different versions of the black box problem, because I actually think there are multiple versions of it. So the second question, how do we track interpretation of internal structures in evolving AI algorithms? That's actually, I see more as a question for engineers. Because I myself, as I sort of suggested, I'm not an engineer, right? So I will say a bit about some research that I'm aware of on the topic of how this can be done, with the caveat that this is not necessarily something that I'm a personal expert in, but this is something that is obviously crucial. And if anyone has insights into how that works, I'd be very curious to hear them. And I'm also going to say a bit about this third question about how we go about creating institutions to address accountability, because that actually is something that I take myself as having some thoughts about. And as it turns out, the thoughts are actually not that complex. It's almost going to be things that you could, I kind of get how that works. I maybe saw that. But the hope is, in any case, that I can put my finger on it really clearly and help people to see how some of the reasons for generating institutions of accountability could work in an ethically sort of robust way. So with that said, as I said, I mean, a lot of philosophers like to talk about what we're not talking about. And the reason I think it's important is because the question of philosophy and artificial intelligence has actually been around for quite some time, but people have really been talking about different kinds of things that are not necessarily relevant to the context that many of you are working in. So the philosophy of artificial intelligence, as I read it, dates back to 1950 with the publication of Alan Turing's famous paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, where he proposed a criteria to test whether some computer was actually artificially intelligent. And there's been a lot of discussion about the so-called Turing test. So I'm not going to be talking about that for pretty obvious reasons, because it's been well covered, and it's not necessarily relevant to the context of data-driven professionals working in fields that have to take account of the ethics of using artificial intelligence. These are not the questions that you're dealing with. Another question concerns the question of the personhood and moral status of artificial intelligence, right? So you can ask questions like, if we had a genuine artificial intelligence, would it be permissible to shut it off, right? Does it have the right to make claims on us, regular old flesh and blood humans? So again, for pretty obvious reasons, we're not going to be talking about that today. Going down the list, there's this really great puzzle that's been pressed by some pretty famous individuals over the last few years called the control problem, right? So I jokingly refer to this as the Skynet problem for those of you who are familiar with Terminator films. So this is the problem of, suppose we were to create a super intelligence, how would we be able to control it? How would we be able to prevent it from destroying humanity? So for pretty obvious reasons, I'm not going to be talking about that. But for what it's worth, very intelligent people and very successful people are very concerned about this problem. Stephen Hawking, before he passed away, claimed that this is one of the biggest problems currently facing humanity. So while I believe that we could discuss this problem interestingly, it's not going to be a topic for discussion today. So I've said a bit about what I'm not going to be talking about, and I want to introduce a distinction that explains why I'm essentially saying these things. So we can distinguish between general AI and narrow AI, right? This might be familiar to some of you who are familiar with this. So general AI is an artificially intelligent machine that can think in a broad variety of modalities, right? This is what we imagine when we imagine a super intelligence that can interact with humans, or we imagine a machine that can pass some Turing test and hence would count as an artificial intelligence from that perspective. But I imagine that the uses that most of us are interested in here are usages of AI that are more narrow than that. These would be machines that can think, quote unquote, think in a sort of singular modality or in a small set of modalities, right? So a narrow AI is an AI that's designed for or trained for a very narrowly defined purpose or set of purposes. If you note, when I introduce the term general AI, I use the term think straightforwardly. When I use the term think with respect to a narrow AI, I put scare quotes around it. And that is very intentional, because when we're talking about narrow AI, we're essentially talking about very, very computationally advanced algorithms that can do something narrowly similar to what human beings do. But I take it as more obvious that the term think would apply to a general AI. If you go to sort of famous fictional examples of very smart AI systems, it's relatively plausible to say that those things are thinking in the way that humans think. But narrow AI, I don't know if it's actually plausible to say that they think in the way that a human thinks. So that's a crucial distinction to sort of set the ground for where we're going to be here today. So a very specific set of ethical problems have been raised from the perspective of narrow artificial intelligence. So the first problem I call the question of algorithm design and moral theory. So those of you who've read a bit about the ethical problems in designing crash algorithms for autonomous cars will see that as a familiar kind of problem. That's a question of how we set artificial intelligence as priorities, right? How we design cars to quote unquote think about human life when they collide with other cars, right? When we have cases where cars can act autonomously. So again, I think those are very interesting issues. I have some thoughts about that, but I'm not going to specifically get into that today. Another question that is absolutely crucial and has gotten probably the most press of any issue here is the question of bias uptake. So there are really famous high profile cases of narrow AI systems acting in racially biased ways, acting in gender biased ways, particularly serious in terms of facial recognition. The discussion of sentencing algorithms is really shocking, and this should make us all quite uncomfortable. So those issues have been discussed better by people more qualified than me. If any of you are interested in that, I strongly urge you to go watch the Netflix documentary called Coded Bias, where this is discussed in great nuanced detail. It's a really good piece, and it gets into these questions in a much clearer way than I myself do. So narrowing down even more, there's this third problem called the black box problem. Again, it's gotten some press, but I think it's something that I myself can say a bit more about because it's a more, in a way, philosophical question, and a question that we can address through the tools of applied ethics, which is really what my own field of expertise is. So the black box problem is the problem of explanatory opacity. So I'll get into that. So the black box problem arises because artificial intelligence systems in this kind of narrow way are what we would call deep neural networks. So again, not being an expert in this topic, not being a software engineer, I'm going to stay a little bit high level in terms of, a little bit broad in terms of what exactly this stuff is, with the caveat that any of you who know more are more than welcome to fill in the gaps after I finish my my little discussion here. So basically, the relevant property of deep neural networks is that they sort of work independently of the engineer's design. The engineers essentially set up a system and basically aim it at some problem or set of problems and say, solve this problem. But the way the deep neural network works is sort of informed by its own initial setting in combination with the actual training that it engages in. So basically these things have internal layers, and the layering itself is autonomous. That is, designers set up the system, but once it's set up, the system can kind of set the layerings the way it decides based on how it goes through actual cases and the way it makes predictions that are more or less well confirmed. So another issue is that the layering involves a weighting process where it sort of sets the relevance and tunes the way that the layers look for particular things when it's what we would say when it's searching for something in whatever it's being trained to search for. So I'll talk about a specific example in a moment. And so another way in which it's autonomous is that it sets its own parameters and weights. The take home from this is really that deep neural networks are extraordinarily complex internally, in a way that makes it sort of impossible for even the most sophisticated engineer to fully explain their internal operation, meaning that deep neural networks are opaque to us in a certain kind of way. So to give in just a really quick example, deep neural networks in medicine have been proposed for the diagnosing of cancers, right? The idea is that you can feed images into deep neural networks and train it to search those images for aberrations that are associated with cancer, right? And so the way to bring the example out, the way that that these machines search is essentially determined by the machine's own actions, right? It sets its own sort of internal parameters, and the engineers can't explain how it picked up on the things that it picks up on. They can show you that it works, but they can't explain how it works. And this has been taken by people to be a kind of ethical problem, right? So to see why this is an ethical problem, again, because I myself work primarily in medical ethics and bioethics, I'm going to work from that example with the caveat that this can be pitched in a number of different kind of ways. So in medical ethics, we take the principle of informed consent to be extremely important, right? This is the idea that patients have a right to make decisions about their healthcare. They have a right to make choices about what will be done to their bodies, right? This is not a sort of complex thing. This is very intuitive, that people have a right to make decisions about their care. But the principle of informed consent requires understanding, right? It requires that people understand why decisions are being made. It requires that people understand the risks and benefits of decisions. And in a sense, it requires that the patients understand how the doctor reaches a particular decision, right? So if we had some artificial intelligence system that was making medical decisions like treatment and diagnosis, that system would be in tension in at least some kind of way with the principle of informed consent, because AI diagnosis and process are not understood sort of based on just the intrinsic nature of black box algorithms, right? So if there's a right to informed consent and black box algorithms undermine the understanding criterion for informed consent, black box algorithms violate patient rights. And I think you could pitch a version of this argument for basically any AI system where people have to consent to it. And I will say, although I specifically talk in the context of medical ethics and I specifically leverage the principle of informed consent, you might argue that we can appeal to other principles like the principle of accountability and a principle of trust. And if you can show that you can't trust an AI system, or if you can't be accountable to an AI system, or if an AI system can't be accountable, then you can also generate this argument that black box AI systems violate patient rights. I should say that I put the sort of discussion in terms of rights, but there are other ways to frame this as well. So, a more nuanced and longer discussion might allow us to get into some of that, but I'm going to move on to one prominent current attempt to solve the black box problem. So you might be thinking to yourself, I don't need to understand. Actually, I don't need to understand everything perfectly in order to make good decisions, right? Because I can understand that something works without understanding how it works. This is essentially a resolution of the black box problem that's been proposed by a bioethicist named Alex John London in a journal article a few years ago. We might be able to get empirical evidence that a black box AI system works, that it aids diagnosis, that it improves outcomes, even if we don't understand or have a theory about how it works, even if we can't explain its operation. And as it turns out, actually a lot that medicine does is kind of like that. A lot of drugs, for example, work very well. They can be empirically shown to work, even though we don't have a good theory about how that they actually work. So statistical evidence can essentially play the role that explanation of the way the system works plays when it comes to justifying the usage of AI systems. And I don't know, check your own intuitions on this, check your own thoughts on this, right? If a doctor came up to you and said, here's an AI system, we have really good empirical evidence that if I use it, I can diagnose your health conditions with better accuracy, and I can come up with a better plan of treatment for you, even though you don't necessarily perfectly understand how it works, what would you think? Would you say that that violates my rights? Or would you think to yourself, huh, all right, I can see why I'd want to use that, right? My thought, again, and you tell me what you think later on, my thought is that many people will be put at ease by statistical validation of AI systems, right? So I think that's a reason to believe that AI systems may not be as problematic from the perspective of opacity and explanation as some might be inclined to think. Now, however, in my own published work, so this is the sort of main topic that I want to come to. I argue in my paper that there is a potential problem with London's answer, that automation creates a kind of moral gap in our systems of accountability, right? So a system of accountability is a set of norms and institutions that create accountability structures that make people feel as though individuals are accountable for what happens within the context of their care. Again, speaking specifically in terms of medical ethics, I think this essential dynamic arises in other fields as well. But again, I sort of leave it open for you to tell me what you think about that. So what I essentially argue is that you might have a system that is statistically validated, that is, we can point to empirical evidence that it works, but that instituting it would cause a kind of accountability gap, where somebody was accountable for a process that nobody is accountable anymore for. And that could be an ethical problem, because automating a number of tasks might individually be empirically validated. But when we sum up these kind of accountability gaps, we end up with a situation where accountability drops out of an institution, right? Where individually speaking, AI systems may be empirically validated, but because each of those introduces a sort of small but non-trivial accountability gap, we end up with a situation where nobody is actually accountable for what's happening here, right? So I might think to myself, huh, so I have statistical validation for all this stuff, but where'd all the people go, right? Where is everybody? Why is there nobody here anymore? I was talking to a friend of mine recently who went to a very automated meta-merge for a test of some kind, and they signed in without seeing anybody. They were told where to go without seeing anybody. They sat down in the room without seeing anybody. And then a doctor showed up for 15 seconds and did a test, and then they walked out of the building, right? So this is the kind of dynamic that I'm concerned about when I press for this idea of accountability gaps, right? We might be able to improve outcomes, or at least to keep outcomes the same, by automating in that kind of way. But nonetheless, something like accountability seems to drop out of it, because where are the people, right? Where did the people go? And so what I basically do in this paper is propose a moral principle that needs to be met if we want to justify AI systems. And I call it the vanishing accountability principle. AI systems can't be implemented if they would undermine second-order norms of accountability, right? That is, if they would undermine this sense of there being persons in a system that we are accountable to. And conversely, if we don't undermine the system of accountability, AI is great, right? So I take myself as providing an amendment to this idea of statistical justification, right? We need to take a more holistic view of AI implementation effects. If we want to know whether it's ethically permissible to implement some artificial intelligence system, we can't just look at whether or not that individual system is statistically validated. We need to look at how it affects other AI systems. So with that said, that's my published work. That's my sort of where it stands in terms of the published work now. But of course, we philosophers don't like to let conversations end. So in my work as I go through it, I'm no longer quite as satisfied with even this, right? Because it seems to me that we can actually satisfy the vanishing accountability principle, but still introduce epistemic disparities between people. So I'm going to define what I just said in a moment. So the basic idea is that people within systems of accountability may have differential abilities to understand what's going on within the context of those systems, right? So the way I set up the vanishing accountability principle assumes that everybody comes to the system of accountability in exactly the same way. But as a bare empirical fact, I actually think that may not be true. There may be people who come to it with better understanding than others. And so the black box problem may arise again, even within the context of the vanishing accountability principle. So for those of you who it may have been a long time since your last philosophy class, I'm essentially talking about the field of epistemology now. Now, the field of epistemology is the subdiscipline of philosophy that studies the concept of knowledge, right? They study what knowledge is, where it comes from, how much knowledge we have, how we gain knowledge. Now, this field has been around for millennia. Plato created it. But for what it's worth, it's developed in a way that is really fascinating in the last few decades. So within epistemology, there's a field of inquiry known as epistemic injustice. So this dates from a philosopher by the name of Miranda Fricker, who I am blessed enough to know personally, and who is actually one of the people on my committee. Who argues that people can be treated unethically in their capacity as knowers. People can be not heard or believed when they express ideas. People can be excluded from the knowledge community in really troubling and insidious ways. So, you know, there are some examples that have been proposed here. So, marginalized people are often unintentionally ignored in professional settings. Even when people have, you know, progressive attitudes, this often happens accidentally. And what Fricker says is that in those situations, we have essentially a kind of epistemic injustice occurring because we have people giving testimony, sharing ideas, expressing their own knowledge, and being undermined in that capacity, right? So Fricker essentially argues that those people are treated unethically and that it's a distinctive kind of unethical behavior, what we know as epistemic injustice. Another example that's proposed, so here's a question, right? What would we say about a person who experiences sexually inappropriate behavior at the workplace in a world where sexual harassment has never been named as a concept, where no one can point to that activity as being unethical, right? So what Fricker argues in the 7th chapter of this book, which I think is the best chapter, is that those are people who are essentially excluded from the knowledge economy, right? People who are not able to name their experiences in certain kind of ways. And so those people experience a kind of epistemic injustice as well. So why am I talking about these sort of hot topic-ish ethical issues? Well, that's because I essentially argue, sorry, I forgot, yeah, there's one issue that there's a duplicate slide there, so I'm going to skip past that. So why am I talking about that in the context of artificial intelligence? Well, essentially, I would argue that people can be treated epistemically unjustly within the context of artificial intelligence, right? That because understanding the situation with respect to artificial intelligence and being able to understand why the vanishing accountability principle has been satisfied even after artificial intelligence has been introduced, can introduce kind of knowledge economy disparities, right? So I specifically pitch this problem in terms of science literacy, right? Not everyone's good at interpreting the details of science, and that might be for systemic reasons, right? Marginalized groups may have already been subject to injustices here, and so interpreting the details of AI science actually ends up being a crucial part of being able to understand the institution's accountability, right? And being able to see that one's participating in an institution that is just requires that you understand certain details of AI science. It requires you to understand the difference between explanation and statistical validation, which is something that people can learn. But the point is that some people are at a disadvantage from being able to actually understand those things. As I phrase it on the slide, not everyone is well placed to understand how AI relates to their experiences, which means that my principle can actually be satisfied, but that injustices might kind of seep in through the back door, right? That some people can be treated unjustly by the implementation of AI, even if others don't experience an injustice there, right? So that basically AI can be a black box to some people and to not to others, even if the vanishing accountability principle is satisfied. So this is essentially preliminary work. I have a work in progress paper that I have been developing for a little while on this topic. I'd be very curious to hear what people think the issues are, if this makes sense, if this tracks with experiences, etc. So I wanted to sort of share some of my work in progress. So crucially, this is not just a medical ethics problem. Injustice is cumulative, that an educational disparity can later turn into a different kind of patient rights violation. So when we implement AI systems, I want to argue that we should think of it in terms of epistemic justice, right? Making sure that everybody and not just some people have the ability to participate in the sort of knowledge economy with respect to those systems once they are implemented. I'm almost at an end here. So a few comments in closure. So institutions should try to do something to level the epistemic playing field. So first, systems should try to educate their patients, or more broadly, their consumers, on the role of artificial intelligence. We might be able to design systems that open the technology to everyone, regardless of education status. So Eric Topol, who is a cardiologist who writes a lot about artificial intelligence, has pointed to a really interesting study that I want to bring people toward. So they were developing an algorithm to use an AI system to diagnose diabetic retinopathy. So you can use retinal scans to diagnose diabetes. And what they discovered is that you can actually design a patient feedback system that helps the patient to understand how the system narrowed down on a certain feature of their retinal scan that was associated with a problem. So by sort of implementing technology that allows patients to interact with AI systems, you might be able to get around some of these epistemic disparities, right? You might be able to help people understand a bit about how the technology works, right? Understand that it works in these kind of statistically validated, targeted ways. So I would also just say, again, we see here how artificial intelligence implementation and the justification of it is holistic, right? Ethical implementation requires broader societal changes in how we think about science and technology education. So science and technology education might not anymore be sort of something that people learn as a basis to later go on and learn something else. Secondary schools might have a role in making sure people can meet a minimum level of technology literacy, especially as artificial intelligence comes to become more and more ubiquitous over the next few decades, as it certainly promises to. So I'll harp on this again, right? Societal changes need to occur, right? It's not just individual firms that need to make these decisions. In a sense, individual firms can't control how people learn about science and technology, right? So the ethical implementation of AI will require societal changes in how people learn about science. We need more effective encouragement of scientific perspectives from the top, right? We need people with positions of authority, like people within governments and educational institutions, to work to implement better science education. And I will sort of say, I mentioned earlier that film Coded Bias, so this will be the point that I close on. So it tells the story of a data scientist turned ethical AI activist who essentially successfully or lobbied Congress for better regulation on facial recognition technology. In those hearings, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a famous Democrat, and Jim Jordan, a famous Republican, agree about this issue in at least some way. So what I like to say is that when AOC and Jim Jordan agree that institutions need to shift to better accommodate this technology, you know we're talking about something that's really important. So I've taken up enough of your time, and I'm excited to hear what our discussants have to say. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Felder. You'll get used to hearing that. I want to encourage anyone that's interested, you can do it at any time, but I know that you have a website that you can share with people. I invite folks, if you want to share your contact information in the chat, that's great. I know some people have already shared, but if somebody wasn't already on when you shared, they won't get it. So if you did it before, you might want to do it again. So what we're going to do is we're going to get some feedback. Yeah, please do. Feel free to open up your cameras. We appreciate that. So it's nice to see who's out there. I just want to say hey to Carmen. I saw you before. I'm glad you're here with us today. Thank you. Hi, Ewan. So I'm going to take our discussants in the order I originally agreed, but there's a couple of folks that I know are going to have comments about what we just heard. But we're going to start with Michael Welling. So Michael, if you want to say anything more about yourself, and then any comments or questions. And if you don't have a microphone, if you wouldn't be able to actually join the conversation, feel free to enter any questions in the chat or comments that you like, and we'll read them to everybody else. Go ahead, Michael.
Thank you very much. I also want to say hi to Carmen. Hi, Carmen. And also and Angie Dahl. If Angie's there, I can't wait for her to say hello and just to connect some dots. Angie.
Hi, Michael.
Hey there. So Angie was with Be the Match Foundation when my son was in need of his bone marrow transplant. And she was a friend that we found each other and have stayed together for so long. So I'm so happy that you're here. Dr. Felder, I'm going to keep calling you that. I know you're not going to get tired of it. The last slide that you put up talking about the recommendations for society, on one hand, all those things sound like recommendations that we learned just from this COVID episode over the last year and a half. But I'm just curious about just some other instances, if you will, pre-COVID, of where there was a potential failing of that, sort of encouragement of scientific perspectives from the top.
So, I mean, in a sense, this has been a problem for a long time, right? So if you look at some of the issues regarding vaccination, for example, this is not a new issue. People who oppose vaccination, I mean, this is an idea with a rich history in a certain kind of way, right? So I think what we see now by the expansion and rapid adaptation of technology essentially just accelerates trends that have already existed. There's always been skepticism about science. There's always been ideological beliefs that science is, for example, in tension with religion, which is optional to say the least in my own view. Although, of course, people disagree with me. So do I have lots of specific examples? I mean, I can come up with a few more. I mean, the way in which important information is buried in terms of service agreements has been around for a long time. It's been something that I've thought about for a good amount of time in the past. So, there's a question about whether or not terms of service agreements could be designed in a more ethically robust kind of way. A similar kind of problem is informed consent documents in medicine, which can often be miles long and which contain very important information that gets buried. So, the idea that people can have their scientific literacy improved is not necessarily a solution to those problems, but it at least is the beginnings of a solution as I see it.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Ryan. So I'm going to turn to Scott Lett next. And, it seems to me there was some conversation when you and I first knew each other about putting into service agreements things like you have to send us your firstborn child just to see if anybody ever actually read them. I'll let you introduce yourself and make any questions or comments. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, Joanne. Yeah, I'm glad you reminded me of that. That's fun. So it is true. We used to put in ridiculous and even horrific things into our software agreements just to see if people were reading them. And very often one of the clauses that was like clause number 43 was, you agree after 30 days of installing the software to turn over your immortal soul. And the fact is, we were never called on that, ever. So what Ryan says, Dr. Felder says, is very true. And that is that some of these things hide the truth by telling too much of it, that the contract language is long. One of his examples from his paper of lithium as a treatment for bipolar disorder reminds me of that. And that is that 70%, according to one study, of physicians that prescribe lithium do not follow the safety instructions for follow-up testing of blood serum levels of lithium that are in the black box warning label. And if any of you have seen those big fold-out sheets of paper you get with prescription drugs, the black box warning label is supposed to attract your attention, but some of those are so long they're completely unintelligible even by doctors. And so the idea to simplify the description and the language so that real people can understand them has become really important. I was really glad to hear in the talk the discussion of epistemic injustice, because by the time you get to the statistical question of a diagnosis, a lot of the ethical battles have been fought and won or lost, and a big bunch of those hinge around the idea of representation of knowledge, of the fact that classification of people and of outcomes can even be done, is built into assumptions in the model, and those are encoded into how the model works. And because the model is so big and complex, people shrug and say, I don't know how it does that. But you can trace it back to things like that the assumptions that race is objective and binary, or at least categorical, and that sex or gender are binary, and that these things are built into the models as assumptions because our language builds them in. And it will take a change of recognition of the science underlying those assumptions, going back to the language changing and going back to the way people are educated to understand how these things are different, before we finally come back to the question of, can we make a model that doesn't encode and weaponize injustice? And so I was really, really excited to hear that that's your next area of investigation, because I think that's where some of the battle lines are being drawn, and it's, you know, built into the mathematical assumptions of all of these tools. The question I have is the relative importance of accountability versus autonomy. That, you know, the accountability is sort of whom we hold accountable if something goes wrong with this system, and what they're accountable for. I'll check my grammar later. And versus, you know, who has rights of autonomy to know what's going on, to have control over what's going on. And patients interact with this idea in a bunch of different ways. Do they have autonomy on who gets to see the data about them, how long those people get to have access to it, and what it gets used for? And a lot of their knowledge of how it gets used is hidden away in the use and misuse of private data amongst, you know, corporations and institutions and research. And a model can encode private information about somebody and make it look like it's something completely different, and yet, you know, with precision, identify a certain person with their data, even though it looks like that data is hidden. And the other one, of course, is how do I have autonomy to understand how this diagnosis works, what my treatment options are, how certain is the diagnosis? Is there a chance it's something else? And so the idea of how we pick and design our models to come up with a cancer, no cancer, for example, is another assumption that may not hold true. And the model, you know, has uncertainty built into it. I mean, the data going in has noise and errors. The model introduces new noise and errors, and there is empirically, you know, some gray areas. And so systems that both communicate that gray area and acknowledge it as part of the system and have safety mechanisms installed are really important, I believe, in you know, a safe and effective system for diagnosing cancer, for example. And it's not just the algorithm, but it's the device, how it was engineered, and the people using it, are they well trained? And are they trained well enough to describe to real world patients what it's doing? So I think those are really important. And I think one of the areas, the writings I've seen that put autonomy first and almost everything else second are the WHO guidelines on ethical principles in AI. And so I think that to me was really interesting because it sort of mimics the European view of who's got the rights over someone's private data. And in Europe, the decision has been made. It's the person's own choice who gets that data, when and how, and whether that data has to be deleted or not. The right to have your data be forgotten is paramount. And so I'm wondering, where Ryan thinks that falls. Where does autonomy fall compared to responsibility and accountability, and are all three of those things, how important are they to fostering trust?
I'd love to speak specifically to autonomy and the role it plays here. I mean, I very much would, if you were to ask me how this works, right? I would say that it's easy to view autonomy as a kind of intrinsic ability that people have, right? Like, you are a person, and so you are autonomous, you are a decision maker. But one of the things that a lot of people in bioethics like to push on is the idea that that is the right way to understand autonomy. So I'd actually sort of go the other direction, right? I'd say that we can't have autonomous decision making if we don't have accountable systems, right? I think that accountability is essentially a kind of precondition for autonomy. So to take the example of data usage, right? Like, how can I be an autonomous user of data, right? I'm not a data scientist. I'm a philosophy professor, right? I'm a decent one, but I'm not an expert in data science, right? So how can I make autonomous decisions about what I'm going to be doing if the institution isn't doing a little bit of work to help me, right? If it isn't sort of pitching things in a way that allow me to understand it, right? So if I don't have an understanding of how my data is going to be used, that's something that I can understand. How can I make a decision at all about how I want it to be used? I mean, you see this. I mean, this is I just happen to know a little bit about it. I mean, this is a particularly huge issue with biobank research, right? Where samples are taken from people and used for medical research. But how to get informed consent for the usage of that, I mean, it's virtually impossible to see how it can be solved, right? Because you either have to update that informed consent as the usage of the sample changes, or you don't. If you have to update it, it becomes impossible to satisfy because you need to find people decades after they've given their samples. And if you don't have to update it, you're not actually giving informed consent, right? So even the bare ability to exert autonomy requires institutional design, which is why something like, for example, I'm not that familiar with it, but something like the way a European Union system would set it up, where people have the right to make decisions over it. Essentially, it privileges a certain kind of person who has the time and ability to understand how their information is going to be used. I don't know. I don't have an answer to like what ought to be done, because again, this is a sort of it's an empirical question about how algorithms get designed and how we can provide information to individuals about how things are used. And to take your example, how we can provide information about how data usage works. But the point is that it requires real effort on the part of institutions to even get people to the point where they can make decisions. And I'm sort of skeptical that we've actually gotten there so far. But I think that improved science in terms of actually designing these systems is going to be a part of it, and better social education is going to be a part of it. In that we need to help people to understand what's actually going on. We need to get people to a point where they can actually come to medicine with an understanding of what's going on. The bare idea of even doing that is not something that we as a society are close to yet. So yeah, I mean,
I'm going to bring in a new voice. This has been really interesting discussion. I'm going to invite David Mohajer in a moment, but just before we move on from you, Scott, you didn't really introduce yourself. You just want to tell everybody briefly what you're all about.
Well, let's see. I'm trained as a mathematician and engineer, and I've worked in the sciences and engineering for 40 years, and in machine learning and the practice and building of machine learning systems to solve problems in a number of different industries for at least 30 of those years. And so that has led me to learning more and building companies that not only built those systems, but had to build systems for creating repositories of data, communicating about data to people that don't understand machine learning, and all of those things, and running into ethical issues in just about every industry in which I've worked, and had to sit back and think to myself, am I doing this in a manner that's ethical, and am I even working on a thing that's ethical from the outset? So it's fun to hear a practitioner in that philosophy do a better job of that than I have, but at least I've been here and thinking about it for about that long. So that's my introduction, and
Thank you.
I give a different one
Thanks.
each time, but that's one for today.
That's good. That's good. Well, over the years, we try different faces, don't we? David, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little about xahive? And any comments or questions for Ryan? I have a feeling you've been sitting on your hands, so I really want to hear what you have to say.
Hi, I'm David Mohajer. I'm the CTO of xahive. This is my boss and co-founder, Sem. So yeah, we've done a little bit of work on writing about the cybersecurity ethics of AI, so like a very hyper-focused little area. And one of the things, and by the way, thank you and congratulations, Dr. Felder. One of the things that we were discussing and thinking about was the public acceptance and the answer to your question that you posed during your presentation, like, would you accept the diagnosis of an AI? And I think that also ties in with the black box problem. So how does it work? What is it doing? What are the algorithms doing? How is it determining things? You know, when AI technology was first being researched, by DARPA, they had things where they were looking for tanks in the bushes, and it turns out that it was just finding the darker images, and that was the one with tanks in it. And that sort of stuff, once it gets complex enough, it doesn't really matter. What matters is the hit rate, and you can test that versus the human hit rate and say, well, look, this is how often the doctors are finding cancer early, and this is how often the AI is finding cancer early based on having the AI go through historical records of people, and you can look at the false positives and real positives versus the human analysis and say, well, yes, we don't know exactly how it's making those determinations, but here's the statistics. As you said, statistics can explain it, and that's a simple example of a way to explain it to people that they would understand without having to understand math or statistics or probability theory and all that sort of thing. So.
Well, thank you. Let's see, Paul Savage, would you please introduce your? Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have a question for Ryan?
Sam had a question.
Well, we're going to hear from someone in a little while.
Later.
She's going to bring us home a little later. Yeah.
All right.
All right. Paul, would you please go ahead and introduce yourself?
Well, thank you very much. My name is Paul Savage. I've spent my career in healthcare administration and have been very involved with competitive business intelligence, as well as the operations and the structures of our many institutions in the New York region. I am an engineer by training and background, Scott, so I'm really impressed with your background as well, and Ryan. It is wonderful to hear your perspectives. But I just wanted to raise the specter that over the course of many, many years now, HIPAA has been a very instrumental tool in trying to understand where are the ethical responsibilities. And certainly there are guidelines that have come down from the CDC and others that hopefully can help guide us. And as you've been describing, neural networks are really a very old technology. And it was never really intended to be faced with these kinds of ethical questions or concerns. Regression analysis, which is totally separate and apart from that, is also a very old technology that we can use to begin to hypothesize about the role of relationships of different variables. And we in healthcare administration are being faced with more variables than we can possibly begin to understand. Social determinants, networking, diagnostic tools, these are all growing at exponential rates, and trying to make sense is not within the human brain. We don't have the ability to look at 1,000 different variables and identify which ones are significant and are not significant. So in many respects, I'd like to suggest that this whole field of AI technology has hardly begun. We are still in its infancy, and we have a long way to go. And I certainly hope that some of the guidance of HIPAA begins to be embraced. And I like to use the example, as I do regression analysis or competitive business intelligence, I'm not allowed to report any data element unless I have a sample size of at least 11. I wouldn't begin to report on much of anything from a statistical point of view unless I have a data collection system in literally the hundreds of millions. And this is exactly what we're seeing with the COVID virus. We have 160 million people who have been vaccinated, and still there are doubters out there. For what reason? I don't want to even begin to try to explain. But we really do need to educate the public to understand that a 2% failure rate exists in everything that we do. And we really do need to depend on our physicians, our practitioners, our clinicians to bring relevant information to the patients. And if the physician is trusting in the AI in understanding a heart attack being diagnosed by a machine, then hopefully we will begin to address these concerns and considerations that you've brought so forward for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Carla Romney.
Well, first, did Ryan want to respond? Anything?
I'd be happy to talk, but you know, I talked a lot,
Okay.
so I feel like I'd definitely open the room up for others.
And I also see that AW has a hand raised, so I'm willing
It's
to
all
wait a
right.
moment.
We'll
You want-
def-
okay, that's fine.
everybody, everybody will get a chance. I want to hear our prime discussants first,
No,
and then we'll
that's
actually
totally
call on
fine.
everybody. Armani, we want to hear from you for sure. But go ahead, Carla.
So Dr. Felder, thank you for a great talk. It was really exciting to be among your first public audiences to be able to say that to you. And I'm honored to have been one of those people. And I hope that many of the other people who are on this call today will remember this day fondly, as you hopefully will as well.
I can assure you, my dad is listening, so he's
I saw
he's
some
very,
other
very
Felder.
enjoyable.
I saw David Felder there, so I thought there was some connection there, perhaps.
Good guess.
Unless Felder just became the most popular name in, you know, and that could be a whole statistical conversation that we could delve into another time. But you were defying the odds, if you will, of having two Felders among, you know, 20 or 30 people here. So. Fantastic, and I'm thrilled that your dad is here to witness this as well. That's really makes it even more special, I hope. So my interest, as you probably have maybe discerned from our brief earlier conversation, is really in the academics of STEM and biomedical sciences in general. And in my role at the Westchester Biotech project, I helped to coordinate a lot of the educational activities, including a certificate program to engage learners really in jumping those first hurdles into careers in the biotech industry. And one of the key pieces, and I think your last slide or two where you really spoke about the societal implications and the urgent need for educational activities, not just at the graduate and postdoc level, but really reaching way back into our pre-college space, resonates really strongly with me. The other comments today that resonated with me, and I'll just share them, and I think it came out through both Scott's and Paul's comments, are this issue of the large data sets that are being acquired. And the one that I'm particularly interested in, and that I think knits together a lot of today's conversation, is the NIH All of Us initiative, which is a huge biobank repository that I'm sure many people on this call are probably well acquainted with, which is an attempt to gather samples from as many people across the U.S. and in as representative a patient sample as they can get, in order to be able to have training data sets of biomarkers and a whole bunch of other biomedical, so hands-on biomedical data, but that can be correlated with genetic markers of disease, genetic biomarkers, as well as so expressed and unexpressed sequences at this point. And so really looking at the issue, and one of the pieces, and I want to tie this back to your papers that you really spoke a lot about, and in your talk as well, beneficence and sort of the fundamental bioethical considerations. When I think of those, I also think very cogently in the conversation about informed consent, I hark back to the Belmont report and the call for respect. And I found it curious that in both of your discussions, and I don't know the field of bioethics, I'm not a bioethicist, but certainly I've done a myriad of IRB trainings as somebody who conducts human subjects research. And so I deem this issue of informed consent, and I view it, and I'd love to hear why I'm wrong, because clearly I am, as fundamentally an issue of respect for the individual and not as much a focus on beneficence. And I'm really personally curious to hear how this issue of informed consent, which troubles Paul, and I think it came up in Scott's conversation, and certainly Dr. Felder, it came up in yours as well. But the idea of what is the interplay, because the idea of respect for the individual and the autonomy and being able to make informed consent really is an issue of respect for the individual. And so I'd like to hear how those play together in your vision.
Yeah, I'd like to specifically respond to that. So, I mean, obviously the concept of informed consent it used to be beneficence, but now is generally regarded as the core concept of bioethics. That informed consent kind of justifies anything pretty much. But there is this, question of what underlies the idea of informed consent, right? Why it matters. And there's significant disagreement about that. I mean, some people are going to say that informed consent is just a procedure for bringing about the best consequences. Some people are going to say that informed consent expresses autonomy, or that it's a sort of necessary condition, to use your language, for respect for persons. Still others are going to say it's just a ritual that doctors and patients go through to make sure that patients aren't coerced, right? So I guess I will sort of address it by saying that my view on informed consent as I present it here definitely assumes the less robust concept of informed consent. It assumes something a bit more transactional, that informed consent is really sort of about allowing people to maybe feel as though they have been a participant in some kind of process. But I also have assumed that it requires some kind of understanding, right? It can't just be based on mistaken information. It has to be based on legitimate information that is really understood. But questions about, how far that understanding has to go, how much information has to be understood, how detailed it needs to be, are totally open in what I say. I very much suppose that there just is this conflict between informed consent on the one hand and this sort of black box aspects of medical care on the other hand. And the assumption really has been, look, we fill that in by just being able to know certain facts about how our doctors make decisions. But if you're working with a different notion of informed consent, I mean, I don't see myself as being here to argue for a particular notion of informed consent. But to note that there is this different idea of informed consent that might be more demanding seems essentially right to me, because if informed consent is about something sort of ethically deeper in that kind of way, I think it would shift the conversation in an important way. And it very much does raise this question of, that might in a kind of way dissolve the black box problem, because it's less about sort of making sure that the information is understood and grasped by the patient, and more just built into this idea of accountability in the first place, right? That you're not really giving informed consent if the doctor is not accountable in the right kind of way. So it's funny as we go through it, like I'm very used to working with that sort of more narrow notion of informed consent. It's more often used in bioethics just because it is more easily operationalized. We can point to it more easily when we talk about patients and their thinking. But if that can be questioned, then certain aspects of my thesis could certainly be questioned, and perhaps a more later work could address a point like that. So the point is very well taken, and a very good lesson to keep in mind that what I called informed consent here is one view among others that is, and the dispute among them is real and it's controversial.
I'm writing notes of I'm seeing an informed consent event with multiple perspectives. This is great. Thank you both. Sam, would you? Yes.
Could I add one more comment about informed consent? I mentioned a couple of minutes ago interoperability and sharing records across multiple institutions or the entire country, as the case might become. This becomes very problematic, that if a patient is given an informed consent form by their doctor and the patient refuses to sign the informed consent, i.e. to share their data, then the doctor will not deal with the patient. And that becomes a discriminatory process unto itself. Your thoughts on discrimination?
So I'm not exactly sure. I'm sorry, I don't know that I followed the question. So how would it be discrimination if a patient just makes a decision not to participate? I didn't follow that.
Then the physician will refuse to treat the patient if there is no informed consent.
Right. Okay.
That becomes discriminatory.
Yeah, it's interesting because my first impulse, and so by the way, Paul, I'm sorry I skipped you. I didn't mean to skip you because I thought what you were saying was uninteresting. But I thought I could respond to Carla's question a little bit more specifically because I do have thoughts about it. But so when I hear your question, my knee jerk is to say, look, competent patients have the right to refuse care, right? So yes. they have the they meet the Applebaum and Bristow criteria, right?
The physician does not have a right to deny care.
Mm-hmm.
That's discriminatory.
It's coercive. I believe that's another word for it. It's coercive in a way that the WHO prohibits. The guidelines, their ethical guidelines prohibit someone from being denied treatment or being offered economic benefit for any of their decisions. That they cannot be denied essential care.
And I'm putting it in the context of public health, wanting to share records across the entire spectrum. And it puts the physician then in the negative position of denying care.
Oh, how prevalent is that?
Very prevalent.
All right, we're going to move on to Sem, because we have some other people we're going to call on and hear from soon. Sem, tell us about yourself a little bit and any questions or comments for Ryan.
Great. Thank you. My name is Sem Ponnambalam. I'm the CEO and co-founder of xahive. As David said, we're a cybersecurity company. We're really excited to be part of this panel and to hear Dr. Felder speak about the importance of AI. And I was really interested, first of all, about your comments related to marginalized communities and how you know, there's the security aspect, you know, and the AI issues and how it's not a holistic approach. So I really, I'm grateful that you address that, because that's something that's not looked at too often. So thank you for doing that. It's very timely, especially not only from a healthcare perspective, but even in terms of jobs. You know, a lot of employers are now utilizing AI, and you don't realize the biases that are built in when you're going through resumes and so on. So, and it's not just at the airport, right? So as one of the women who even though I have security clearance, I still am not recognized because the system doesn't have me in the system. So my question is, what are your thoughts related to data privacy and security and AI? Because I think you've addressed a lot, but I really would love to hear, Dr. Felder, what you think about that, especially giving access to data that humans shouldn't have access to, right? So yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
Yeah. You know, it's funny because my work has, in a sense, it's very ironic that I'm sort of in this talk, and I feel that tension because my focus has been on different aspects of artificial intelligence. So there's the algorithm design side and there's the data side. And I, you know, by my own admission, don't know a lot about the data side. I know more about how this works in medicine than I do in general. So, you know, I'm very much, I mean, one thing that it seems, you know, that seems really clear to me. So if you take on something that Paul said earlier, right, we have data sets that are just, I mean, gigantic and so far outstrip what any human being could comprehend, right? And it's just getting bigger, it's not going away. And so there very much is this question of like, where, I mean, and I'm gonna disappoint you because I don't have a good answer, but there's a really good question of, you know, if what comes from the data is not something that any of the people whose data is being used could comprehend, there's a real question about whether it matters or what they would want done with their data. And so if you think it does matter, this is a question that needs to be answered. Like why it could actually matter to somebody how their data was being used, even though the data itself, their single data, right, is only a drop in the bucket, ethically speaking, right? So that's why I sort of would be of the opinion that we need to not think in a sort of individualistic framework about this. It's less what individuals need to be done, but how we would want to prevent institutions from using that data, right? Do we want to prevent institutions from weaponizing data to influence people on a micro level, versus do we want to allow institutions to do that? I guess the one insight I would try to bring out is that, you know, this might be a case where thinking individualistically about what people are owed and what their, you know, what rights they have to control their data might be a subtle way of asking the wrong question. I don't think you were asking that question, but I think a lot of people come to this with a sort of individualistic framework. Like, if it's there in the terms of service agreement, you agreed, and so if it's not covered under that, you've been treated unethically. And so I would be worried about framing it in this individualistic way, which again, as I sort of said, it's not necessarily what you were saying, but it is something that I think people do sort of allow to slip in when they talk about this. So I guess my only comment is, like, we need to think again, to use a buzzword I've been using, we need to think holistically about this. We don't necessarily need to think individualistically about it. So I don't know if that's helpful or if that really addresses the concern or the thought, but I guess that's my one take that I'd be willing to share on this topic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks so much for the questions.